Government transparency. Will the public ever really know what happens behind the scenes of our government's affairs? Tony Abbott, at the recent Institute of Public Affairs 70th anniversary gala dinner, announced his support for some of the radical IPA policy recommendations, which included the repeal of the carbon tax and renewable energy target, the abolishment of the Clean Energy Fund, privatisation of Medibank, and the changes to the National Broadband Network, just to name a few. Over the past couple of years, the IPA's cosy relationship with the opposition has been under increased speculation on social media, with some people expressing fears that the opposition may adopt some of the other radical principal policy changes of the IPA, including the end of mandatory disclosure on public donations and an end to public funding to political parties. Swinburne University's politics expert Dustin Hales specialises in Australian party politics, and he said that a potential policy such as the end of public financial disclosure could severely damage Australia's political landscape. He released this statement over email. It's ludicrous to contend that individuals, companies or trade unions who make significant financial donations to political parties will not demand greater access to ministers or senior party figures. Everyone wants access and some expect favours. Political parties are increasingly reliant on donations to finance expensive campaigns, and as a consequence, political parties are now more than ever being beholden to their donors. Put simply, large donations in particular are strategic. They can and do buy influence. Mr. Hales said that the transparency of the Australian government is already poor enough without the possibility of donor anonymity. He said, unfortunately, the Australian system already lacks transparency. Political parties do not need to reveal donations from the previous financial year until October, and then it takes the Australian Electoral Commission approximately 4 months to process the returns for publication. The IPA is an independent, not-for-profit policy think tank that is funded by corporate donors and has been influencing the political and policy debate sector in Australia since 1943. The IPA was one of the number of groups that came together to form the Liberal Party in Australia and became an important fundraising body for the party. Critics have questioned the motives of IPAs, some saying that they're more of a lobbyist than a think tank, with appeals for organisations such as this to disclose their spending and donations to the public. The IPA has a range of high-profile donors, Rupert Murdoch to just name one. The integrity of political parties and their funding matters is not new to the Australian sphere. An inquiry into political donations and disclosures was submitted to the Victorian Parliament Electoral Matters Committee in April 2009. Dr. Carmen Lawrence, a former Minister for Health and Human Services and a member for Fremantle, was an instigating figure for the inquiry, expressing discontent and concern about the then political financing situation, the inquiry told.
I think people in a democracy are entitled to know who's talking and who's paying. And at least that way we can question some of the decisions governments make. I think one of the problems in our democracy is that we don't want decisions to be made by government on the basis of influence that's essentially been purchased by way of donations, whether they're donations to political campaigns or to individuals, or donations that come in the form of, if you like, access, and that sometimes happens too. It's a phenomenon, I think, that is really very dangerous because not everybody can afford it, so it's not an equalising influence. It's one that prejudices decision-making in favour of the moneyed. Some people have called the process one of donocracy, and I think it's a very unhappy input into a democracy.
Was there a live culture of donocracy when you were still in politics?
Yes, indeed, and several of us wrote about it. I mean, it's important to have disclosure, but it's often not timely, even with the existing arrangements. You don't find out until after the event who's given donations. Real-time information struck me as critical, so you know exactly who's giving what to whom and when, and so you can, possibly even link various events.
Dr. Carmen Lawrence said money shouldn't be used to buy political power.
And I'm very unhappy and have been for some time about the fact that some of the fundraising events that both political parties run are ones where people essentially buy a place at the table. They literally get to sit with and talk to ministers in return for a fee that's being paid for that fundraiser. So they're all things I think that need to be improved rather than going backwards. The last thing we want is for donations to become obscure, because we know that it's very easy for people to, in a sense, influence the political process without anyone knowing, and that's a particularly insidious undermining of our democracy.
Dr. Lawrence said that if the Coalition were to adopt the IPA's policy recommendation to end mandatory disclosure of public donations, the potential for corporate influence would dangerously increase.
Well, I think that would be an enormous step backwards. In fact, we should be making what governments do more transparent. And if we don't know who's providing funds to those political parties, and we don't know on what scale, we're essentially being kept in the dark about possible influence. And I don't think it's good enough for any government or opposition, for that matter, to say we're not influenced by the money we get. There's a lot of evidence to show that political parties are influenced by the money they get, and the big corporations actually expect to be able to influence what governments do by way of the donations that they give.
The 2009 report said that electoral funding and disclosure is probably the biggest issue for the Electoral Commission. Do you think that this is still a really big issue in Australian politics?
I do, and especially if we're going backwards. I mean, I think some of the best systems don't have any organisational donations. They only have individual donations, and up to a limit. So if people want to support a political party, that's fine, but these big corporate donations, and for that matter, big union donations that are not properly disclosed, are essentially something to be avoided.